Okay, so last week we covered Hinduism and Buddhism. That leaves us four more for this final segment. I'm going to start with Confucianism and then Taoism, both from China. And then we'll look at Shinto in Japan, and then end with, back in America, Scientology. So we'll pick it up. We are in the East still. We had last week, we looked very closely at the concepts of Dharma, which is your purpose, your natural flow of doing what you're meant to do. We looked at karma, which is the result of either keeping your dharma or failing your dharma. You have good or bad karma from that. And then the final piece of that puzzle, reincarnation. The idea that in order to balance out your good or bad karma, you're going to come back around. If you had excess good karma, you'll move up. If you had excess bad karma, you'll move down. And we saw that with both Hinduism and the two smaller ones we talked about briefly, Jainism and Sikhism, and then also Buddhism. The next two share these ideas. And so we'll dive into that. So we're starting with Confucianism, those that follow the teachings of Confucius. So what is it? And this is one that variously, depending on who you're talking to, is either a school of thought, like a philosophy, or it's a religion, or it's simply a way of life. And different people who follow this are taking it from that different perspective. So there's a little bit of discrepancy there. This is following after the teachings of the Chinese philosopher Confucius. Notice his dates, 551 to 479. The Temple of Solomon was destroyed in 586 BC. So this would have been 35 years later that Confucius was born, while the children of Israel are in exile in Babylon. About halfway through that exile, Confucius is born, and he writes what's called the Five Classics. And the emphasis of his writing, the emphasis of his philosophy, are family values, social harmony. It's not about spiritual things. This is one of the reasons people think of this more as a philosophy or an ethical system, is because he's not really focusing on the spiritual aspect. He's focusing on ethics, on what is my place in society? How do I relate to my family? What is to be expected of me? At its core, this philosophy is humanistic, and humanistic is something that we get in the beginning of the modern era in the West, at least humanism, the idea that humanity has the answers and humanity is the focus of things. It's close akin to Taoism. We're going to talk about Taoism next, and there's a lot of overlap there. And we've already talked about Buddhism. There's a lot of overlap with that one as well. So what does Confucianism have to say then, since it's primarily about ethics and family relationships? What do they have to say about God? The development of both Taoism and Confucianism are as outcroppings of Chinese folk religion. Remember when we talked about Hinduism? We said Hinduism developed over time based upon the local religious beliefs all throughout India, and that's why it's so diverse. Confucianism and Taoism are the outflow of the folk religion of ancient China. And so what they believe about the gods and the spiritual realm has more to do with that than with anything that they come up with per se. So while Confucius is not really talking about the gods, he is talking about your need to respect the gods and your need to respect your ancestors and do the kinds of rituals, the kinds of sacrifices and offerings that would have given honor to your ancestors and to the gods, because it's right and proper. Not so much because of, like, from a Christian or Jewish perspective or even a Muslim perspective, not so much because God is God and God is do these things and the glory and majesty of God and all that, but more along the lines because it's simply the right thing to do. It's what one ought to do. Which again, the idea of dharma, right? You're doing what you ought to do. It's the proper thing. They do believe, in a sense, in something that we might call heaven. It's called Tian. And when we talk about Taoism, I'll explain what the Tao of Taoism is and in some detail. But it's the idea of God, the idea of the spiritual realm is a little more impersonal, a little bit more like the Brahman of Hinduism, not necessarily like a god with a personality and a will and plans and all of that, more impersonal. And so we're not getting a lot of stuff from Confucianism on who God is or what God wants. It's not really the point. So what are the things that they focus on? The things that they focus on are human ethics. And it's built upon the idea that humanity is fundamentally good, that human beings are decent and they can be taught, and we can be perfected. We can be the utmost that we are supposed to be. And the parallel to Western thinking that you might be familiar with, because maybe you had to read this when you were in high school, is Plato's Republic. If you remember Plato's Republic, Plato thought about what a proper society would be like, and he said if we take kids from their very youth and we gave them intensive schooling, and we taught them, of course, art and literature and everything, but we especially taught them what is right, what is good. It was Plato's belief that children would choose the good. If you show people what is good and right, why would they not choose it? Of course, from a Judeo-Christian perspective, that's fundamentally flawed because we believe that we don't have the capacity nor the will to choose the good and the right, certainly not sufficiently. But that's what Confucianism is built upon. And so the idea then is not so much correcting or fixing humanity and human beings as it is cultivating, as it is building up and correcting, or not correcting, making things better. And so we're going to look at the virtues and the ethics that are necessary to make us better people. That's really what the whole point is. They've got 4 different Chinese words for it, but you can see the kinds of things they're talking about. Benevolence and compassion. We're all about that. Those are good ones. Upholding righteousness, certainly. Ritual norms and propriety. We certainly believe that there are the proper things to do in what you ought to be. And then, of course, the ability to see what is right and fair. That would be the ethics and the understanding what is good, what is right. And so there's nothing wrong with those virtues. That's a good ethical system if what we needed was simply an ethical system. There's nothing wrong with this particular ethical system in that respect. The emphasis throughout this, and the thing which you see reiterated and focused upon and repeated, especially in Confucianism here, is filial piety. That's probably the harder way of saying doing what's right by your family. That's a big emphasis. We'll see it also in Japan, of course. Loyalty to your family. In particular, a child's obligations to his parents. Again, something that has a biblical parallel, right? Children obey the Lord, or children obey your parents in the Lord, for it is right. We're all about that. And this sees a modern equivalent and a modern manifestation. If you remember, after the communists took over China after World War II, they instituted eventually what was known as the one-child policy, right? Because they had an overpopulation issue and they wanted to limit that. The problem then, of course, is that in China, a child, a son, is supposed to take care of his parents. A daughter is supposed to take care of her in-laws. So if you have a daughter and you only have one child, there's no one in your old age to take care of you. That's something that you're supposed to do, right? Take care of your parents, help them out in their old age, but they wouldn't have had anyone. And so you end up with a society where you've got 5 million extra males because of all the aborted females, because people are saying, well, we just can't have a daughter if we're only going to have one. But that idea is of course, we're a long way from the start of Confucianism here in the modern era, but that idea is ingrained in Chinese culture, the idea of respecting your parents, taking care of them, being loyal to them, that sort of thing. Very different, of course, from Western society, where we sort of grow up and go out on our own, and maybe we come back and maybe we visit at Christmas or something, or call mom on Mother's Day. For some people, and again, some of that's necessity, right? If you have to move and whatnot, but we're not tied to our family quite like that. So that filial piety, that family piety, is a key virtue in Chinese culture. Many of their stories, right? If you look at the stories that a society tells children or a society creates, right? Its fables, its myths, its literature, they reflect the values of that society. If you look at the same thing, if you look at Homer's Odyssey, what is the Odyssey about? Well, it's teaching a story about how you don't defy the gods, how you don't have too much pride, how, et cetera, et cetera. All through that story are being weaved these morals. Not, Homer doesn't come out and say, now here is the moral lesson. He just puts his character through things which teach it. And this story, this collection of stories, the 24 familial exemplars. So this is one of the most famous Confucian stories, collections of stories within Confucianism. 24 stories about people who did right by their family. All right. Contrast that with, say, the Brothers Grimm and their fairy tales, which are all disturbing and dark, and they're trying to teach children, don't hang out with strangers because they might try to bake you into a pie or whatever, that crazy lady with her gingerbread house. They're messed up stories, but they're all trying to tell a lesson of some kind, whereas here in China, they're very much focused. These are all family stories, right? And so Confucianism eventually becomes adopted by the Song dynasty. There's the dates, 960 to 1297. So the Middle Ages in Europe, as the basis of their government. They had an exam system for civil servants, very progressive in that respect. And until 1905, the exam questions were based on Confucian teaching. In order to get a job as a civil servant, you had to prove that you were adept at understanding Confucian philosophy and ethics. That was it. And so in that system, they chose people based on how well you did on the test, not who your dad was. Your dad could have been famous, your dad could have been rich, but if you failed the test, tough noogies. That's to be appreciated, because then you get people in there who are, at least in theory, better at their jobs and not just because of their heredity. And so it had a huge influence on various Chinese imperial dynasties, going back all the way to the Song dynasty, but others as well. So what about Confucius? You get wild variance in the estimates of how many people follow Confucianism, because it all depends on how you define it and how you count. As low as 10 million, as high as 350 million. Because in China, many people still practice some level of Chinese folk religion. They're still doing some of the things that their ancestors have done for thousands of years. They do some things that are related to Confucianism. They do some things that are related to Buddhism, some things that are related to Taoism. So how do you count, right? Is this person a Confucianist or a Buddhist or neither? I mean, it's hard to get a number for that. And of course, these days, numbers from China we're not going to get, because the Chinese government doesn't want to count religious people of any kind. And so we've got that, but almost all of the people that follow Confucian philosophy, Confucian ethics, Confucian religion, whichever one you want to call it, are Chinese. They're either living in China or Taiwan, still same Chinese culture, or in Korea, where it's very much influenced by Chinese culture, or Vietnam, which is, of course, overshadowed by their neighbor. So it's not a philosophy, a way of life that has adherence in Africa or in America or Europe or anywhere else really other than primarily China. An interesting history with Christianity. When the Catholic Jesuit missionaries arrived in the 16th century, they were the first ones in the modern era to arrive. Remember, I told you last week that a form of Christianity went along the Silk Road to the east, and so in the Middle Ages there was a blend of Buddhism and Christianity that some people were following. But when the Confucianists showed up, they found out when the Jesuits showed up, they found out what Confucianism was. They learned about it, and they said, oh, this is ethics. Do right by your family, be compassionate, be kind. Sure, we can work with this. This is, I'll show you the same stories from the Gospels. They saw no issue, and they saw it as something that you could mesh with Christianity, that you could put together. So much so that their priests dressed as Confucian scholars to show themselves to be people worth listening to. They didn't dress like Westerners. And they had great success, actually, hundreds of thousands of people that were following Christianity with just a few dozen priests. And so it was quite remarkable. However, in the 18th century, when the Dominicans and the Franciscans showed up, they looked at Confucianism and said, well, what's this stuff about your ancestors? This isn't respecting your ancestors, this is ancestor worship, and therefore idolatry, and therefore we have to get rid of all of the Confucian stuff. And so they're basically trying to replace Chinese folk religion, culture, Confucianism with Christianity, which is a much bigger change and a much bigger ask, and something that led to all sorts of difficulty in the expulsion of the missionaries and all sorts of things. So there were two different approaches, and I told you before that this is an ongoing debate and discussion within missionaries, going back to the first missionaries in the 16th century, in the modern era at least. What do we do with the religion of the people that they already have? How do we work with it? Are we replacing it? Are we telling them that that's fine, but I've got something better to build upon it? What is the thing that we're trying to do there? And Confucianism is one of the more difficult ones in that respect, because most of it is just ethics, and decent ethics at that. And the rest of it is Chinese folk religion. But it's hard to separate them out in China because it's all part of Chinese culture. So what happens if a Christian missionary is speaking to someone, and particularly in China, that's a Confucianist, of course, aside from the fact that you're worried about the government at that point, but just one-on-one, what are the difficulties? Well, first off, you're going to have to decide, am I dealing with a religion or a philosophy? Is this a religion that we need to refute, or a philosophy that we can adapt? It's an important question, and as a missionary or a evangelist or someone, you're going to need to know what your answer is to that. But it is so intertwined with Chinese culture. Are you then asking a Chinese person who becomes a Christian to quit being Chinese? To give up the things that in their mind make them Chinese? Are you asking them to be a Westerner? Which is a big step. And could be very offensive and could get, the door shut in your face kind of thing, rather than being something that makes the gospel more attractive. It's a difficult question. And then, of course, at the heart of Confucianism, aside from the ethical emphasis on doing right by your family, is the assumption that humanity is good. That we do not have a rebellion problem, we don't have a sin problem, we have an educational problem. And that is directly opposed, of course, to both Jewish and Christian theology, and so definitely needs to be dealt with. And then lastly, you're not then, if the people believe that they're inherently decent, that they don't have a real problem, people are not focusing on redemption, they're not focusing on forgiveness, salvation. Those are concepts that are foreign to Chinese culture. All right. In America, for the most part, in American history, the question has been, how does one get right with God? And there have been different answers to that question, but most people were under the impression that one needed to do that it was necessary. All right, so we were arguing about how one gets there, not whether or not one needs to get there. Whereas in China, you first have to, like with the Buddhists, or who are, again, with reincarnation, you have to get them to understand, now is the time, make a decision, make a change, you've got to do something here. And so there are some significant barriers that need to be dealt with when dealing with witnessing to those that follow Confucius. Anything not clicking in that? Something that was quicker, we're doing 4 tonight, so they're all a certain percentage shorter. Yes?
Randy, what did Hudson Taylor run into when he was over there? Was it Confucianism?
Yes, with China Inland Mission. The fascinating thing about him is that he followed the example of the Jesuits and had his missionaries dress like Chinese. And they tried to respect the Chinese culture and work with it rather than replace it. Again, those are two different philosophical ideas that a missionary or mission agency, a mission society has to come to grips with. Are we replacing what is already there, or are we modifying what is there? And the answer is not 100% the same every way, because some cultures are far more apart from the gospel than another. If you come upon a culture where cannibalism is normal, then you've got some things you've got to tear down, because we can't work with this. But other ones, we have some things in common, and so that's, as I said, it's a continuing and healthy discussion. Of course, some of the problem is that from time to time, missionaries or mission agencies in one camp are fighting with the other ones, or they're working at cross purposes, and they're getting in each other's way, as the Jesuits and the Franciscans did. The next then is Taoism, or you might see Taoism. That's just a question of what English letter are we going to use when we transliterate this into English. And the thing on the right is the one that you are familiar with. You've seen the yin-yang. You might not know what it is, but you've seen that somewhere. You saw somebody with that tattoo, you saw it on a t-shirt, you saw it somewhere. And that is going to be very central to the understanding of Taoism. We'll get to that in a minute. So what is Taoism? Well, like Confucianism, it is either a religion or a philosophy within Chinese culture and tradition. A little bit more towards religion than Confucianism is, but still blurring those lines. And their emphasis is not so much about living in harmony with your family and your societal obligations, which of course still matter greatly, but on living in harmony with your Tao. And if you substitute the word Dharma, which we learned about in Hinduism and Buddhism, for the word Tao, you've got most of the answer. It is founded, a system, a religion that is founded by a man named Lao Tzu, who is said to have written this Tao Te Ching in the 4th century BC. So we're a couple hundred years after Confucius. We're still in the time before Christ. This would be during the period of the Maccabees, thereabouts in Israel's history. And we're not so much then focused on social order or the rituals that one needs to do for your family and your ancestors. Is a little bit of a different focus. Again, from the outside looking in, from a Westerner, from our perspective, you're probably not going to see a lot of difference between a Confucianist and a Taoist. Much like if I'll share one. If you're not a Trekkie, you don't know the difference between Romulans and no, not Klingons. They're very different. And Vulcans, right? And if you're not a Trekkie, you have no idea what I just said. If you're a Trekkie, you're like, how could you not tell the difference between Romulans and all of their emotions and Vulcans and their control, like Spock? They're so different, but they look the same. They act. They have a similar history, and if you're not a nerd, you don't care. Or I could share many of those. The difference between Marvel and DC. If you're not a comic book nerd, if you don't like the movies, you're like, why isn't Superman in Avengers Endgame? And a nerd's like, oh my gosh, you don't know anything. But if you don't know, you don't know. And this is one of those kind of things where it's very difficult for us to see the difference. Whereas, of course, if you're Chinese, you grow up with this stuff, you know this. But they're going to then talk about the Tao. What is the Tao? And it's a little bit difficult to nail this down and to explain it, but it's the way, the path, the doctrine, the channel, the road that you must follow. Again, very much related to the idea of Dharma that we were talking about, but it's more intuitive. And it's not something that you can necessarily be taught, or as so much as it is something you need to learn and experience. This is not God, and this is not about God. The Tao is not God. It is not worshipped by Taoists. That's certainly not what we're talking about here. One of the ways that they explain Tao is to talk about the cyclical nature of the natural world. The water cycle, the seasons, that kind of stuff. That's all in keeping with Tao because it is flowing naturally. And so as an adherent to Taoism, what you're trying to do is avoid the things which would bring you into conflict with Tao. You want to avoid practices and decisions and ideas that are against your Tao. You want to go with the flow. You want to conform. You want to be kind of like a river that is following its channel. You're not flowing over the banks. You're not spilling out. You're just going the way that you are supposed to go. It's sort of like your dharma, your purpose, and your karma with its actions and reactions. And you can see this in some Chinese martial arts with the emphasis on flowing movement, on using your opponent's movements against them and that sort of thing. Not by any means an expert on martial arts, but you might have seen some of that kind of explanation in movies or something like that. And so what does that lead one to, right? If that's your goal is to go with the flow of Tao and keep with the Tao, what kind of ethics are we going to have? The primary concept then is called Wu Wei, and it is effortlessness, harmony, like flowing water, yielding your will to the natural way of the universe. All right, again, very similar to what Yoda tells Luke in Empire Strikes Back, right? Let it flow through you. You're not trying to control it. You're trying to utilize it. You're trying to understand it and become one with it. All that kind of thought, that kind of idea is going to fit within Taoism. And so the ethical ideas that are going to be foremost in a system like that, they call them the three treasures, would be compassion, moderation, and humility. They're not going to value someone who's out of control. They're not going to appreciate someone with overwhelming pride or someone who insists upon getting their way. These are very much more laid back, very much more go with the flow kind of people. At least, of course, you could always find exceptions, but that is the theory. And when you apply that, of course, to government, you end up with something very laissez-faire, kind of a live and let live, mind your own business, don't interfere with other people's lives kind of thing. So many of the minimalists in America might appreciate the ethics of Taoism, although they wouldn't see themselves as Taoists, of course, but they don't want government involved in their lives or in, things like anti-zoning and free trade and all that kind of stuff. That fits with an idea in general of Taoism because we're just trying to go with the flow. We're not trying to erect barriers, dams, and whatnot to slow things and change things. Again, this all is within a general ethical system with a general understanding of humanity's inherent goodness, right? In the West, we have much more, what's the word I'm looking for here? Much more interfering ideas with government and ethics and education because we think things really need to be changed. Right, that we're needing to make drastic changes in people's lives. Whereas here in the East, we're trying to more work within your nature than change your nature. You with me on that? So what do they have to say about God? Taoism is basically pantheistic. There's no personal deity, there's no supreme deity. Everything is God. The universe, everything within it is part of God. We are all God. They have, however, within that, a pantheon of, you might call them demigods or immortals. They come from Chinese folk religion. They are said to be manifestations of the Tao. They've basically retained the heroes, the immortals of Chinese folk religion and incorporated them into Taoism. Rather than denying that or saying that that's not part of it, they've just went with that. And then eventually we get to this idea, and this is the one that most people understand, and that's the yin-yang. Taoists believe that the universe is in a constant state of creation and destruction. and then, of course, recreation. That good and evil, light and dark, everything that is an extreme is in an eternal dualistic balance. We call that dualism, the idea that if things go up, they must go down, and that everything eventually balances itself out. That there is no more good today than there was before, no more evil today than there was before, because everything universally tends to go back to a balance, which of course is different from Christianity and Judaism. But that is their idea. And if the universe has always been in this kind of balance, why are we trying to make drastic changes? Because of course we can't. This is the way it's going to go back to. Anything we change is eventually going to flow back to the way it came. And so human beings are reflective of that. We are part of the Tao when we live. We are part of the Tao when we die. It's not really about an afterlife. It's not really about life after death per se. These are somewhat difficult concepts for us to wrap our head around as Westerners, but that is the basic idea. You can see, again, all of this in the East has a common thought. Dharma, karma, reincarnation, going with the flow, keeping with your nature, and trying to mold it and shape it rather than transform it. That's part and parcel of what we're talking about here. One of the things that you also might be aware of is Feng Shui. If you watch the home improvement channels, you might have at some point run across someone who is trying to decorate their house according to Feng Shui. Feng Shui is a school within Taoism that tries to make your environment part of the flow of Tao. And so the way that your building is constructed, the way that your furniture is arranged, can either create harmony or create disharmony. And of course, you want it to create harmony. You want to eliminate disharmony. And there are a whole series of principles about where windows are supposed to be and where doors are supposed to be and how many, all this stuff. It's quite complicated if you're into that subset of architecture, but it's something that you would come across in China in particular, or in Chinese communities living abroad. So how is Taoism today? And this is the only map I could find about Taoism. It's not the easiest one to see, but it's something we expected anyway. Almost all the world's Taoists are in China or in Chinese cultural places. That's what we already expected. About 175 million people. Again, a lot of that depends on how you count the people. But here we're looking primarily at people that take part in the religion itself. About 13% of the people in China, give or take, all the numbers there are fudgeable. About a third of the people in Taiwan. So it's more popular in Taiwan than in China. But again, with such a large population and how intertwined it is with Chinese culture, there'll be plenty of people that have some Taoist ideas, some Taoist practices that they've taken up. Just like in the United States, there are some people who do things related to Christianity that aren't Christians. They celebrate Christmas, right? They might even go to church on Christmas, but you wouldn't consider them Christians. They probably don't consider themselves Christians, but it's part of their culture. It's part of their history, and so why not? And Taoism is one of those things that has a lot of impact within Chinese culture, whether you can nail down how many people it are or not. Well, what happens when we talk about Christianity and Taoism? Well, like Confucianism, we first need to decide, is this a religion or is this a philosophy? That's an important question. And like Confucianism, we have to evaluate it based on how intertwined it is with Chinese folk religion, with Chinese culture, because where one begins and the other ends is not always easy to see. So what happens when you witness to, when you share the gospel with a Taoist? You're going to have some of the very similar things as Confucianism, but in this case, of course, you also have no personal God. There's not an emphasis on God that we must relate to, whose commands and precepts we need to follow. That's not something we have. Because, of course, and also with Buddhism and Confucianism and the rest, you don't have people looking for salvation. Again, I've said this a bunch of times, but we really need to get our heads around it. In particular with Buddhism and Confucianism and Taoism, people aren't looking for salvation. They're looking for enlightenment. They're looking for betterment, not to be saved, because they, of course, don't believe they need to be saved. And that's a very different approach and different understanding. And then lastly, something in particular that Taoism has that Buddhism or Confucianism or even Hinduism don't have, and that is this yin-yang, this concept of eternal dualism, the balance between light and dark, which is, of course, not at all what Christianity speaks about, or Judaism, because we believe that in the beginning there was only God. In the beginning there was only goodness and there was only light. That evil is a change that will eventually be remedied. Right? We don't believe that the way that the world is now is the way that it will always be. Whereas they would say, no, this is the way it's always been, this is the way it always will be. You can't change it. Again, another concept that George Lucas borrowed from the East for Star Wars, because he's always talking about the balance of the Force, right? When there's a new Jedi, you have a new Sith, because they balance each other out. And Anakin was supposed to be the one to bring balance to the Force. That didn't work out. But that was the idea. He borrows that. He takes that right from them. And I find if I reference Star Wars, people nod their head a little bit more than just talking about straight Taoism here. At least the younger generation. You guys saw Star Wars, didn't you? At some point, maybe not the new ones, but the old ones. 1977, that was your heyday, some of you. And so, questions about Taoism before we move on from China and Chinese culture. The next two are going to be significantly different, and so we'll note the differences. We've had a lot of commonality: Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism. They may look very differently, but at the heart of them, you've got reincarnation, you've got Dharma or Tao, and it's all really the same kind of thing. Okay, yep?
Now, do they get along together in China with religions, or is there,
Well, they ought to, in the sense that the Taoists believe in going with the flow, and the Confucianists believe in doing right by your fellow man. But of course, human beings being what human beings are, there have always been incidents, even because people don't follow their own religion. But generally speaking, yes, because it's all within that larger Chinese culture. And China, like India, is a massive place. It is a huge place. Eastern China and Western China are not the same thing. There's different ethnic groups within Chinese culture. Most of us don't even know that not all Chinese are the same. Different languages, different ethnicities, different histories. And so you'll have some of that. And of course, a lot of this is all local. What are the local folk religious things that your ancestors, that your family in the village that you grew up in, what do they practice that you connect to Confucianism or you connect to Taoism? And that local flavor will have a lot to do with what someone does as well. And of course, all of this is changing because Chinese culture, or the country of China in the last 50 years went from being mostly rural to being more urban than with hundreds of cities that have more than 1 million people. And so a lot of people are not connected to their roots the way they were before because they're not living in the ancestral village that our ancestors have lived in for these many generations. And again, I'm sure there are people within China that are lamenting that and saying, where are our roots? And we got to get back to where we used to be. All right, the next one is going to take us in a slightly different direction. And it is purposefully not connected to the others. And I'll explain why. The next one is Shinto. And again, from the outside looking in, you might not be able to tell the difference between someone who's Chinese and Japanese, but they sure can. Or between Shinto and Taoism, but they sure can. And they would be very much pointing that out to you. The thing on the right is a Shinto shrine, and the shrines are huge in Shinto. We'll explain why in a minute. Where does Shinto come from? It is the traditional religion of Japan. It is indigenous to Japan. It developed in Japan over the centuries. It was not codified. In other words, it wasn't written down and formalized until relatively recent, until the 8th century. But this is basically Japanese folk religion. that developed on that archipelago, on those islands of Japan, with its, remember, Japan's very isolated in some ways in history because of it being an island, where it's going to be less influenced by its neighbors. So this is developing sort of organically. We'll see that it gets connected to Buddhism here. Shinto means the way of the gods. It means doing things the way that the gods would want you to. And it revolves very much so around public shrines. There are a large number of public shrines, and people who are Shinto go to these public shrines and perform rituals, various rituals, that are supposed to honor the kami. That's what the word for it. It basically is kind of spirits, kind of gods. There's a blurring of the line between spirits and gods. They're very different distinctions for us, but they're more similar in their mind. And so you go to these shrines, you show your devotion. That is the bulk of Shinto. However, from the 6th to 19th century, so beginning in the modern era, 6 centuries after Christ, leading to the 19th century, which is not that long ago, Buddhism and Shinto were completely intertwined, where Buddhist ideas had become deeply ingrained within Shinto. And some things borrowed from Taoists. But when the Meiji Restoration happened, Japanese nationalism was awoken, and they said basically anything that's not Japanese needs to leave. Words, philosophy, religions, foreigners, and they basically purged the country of non-Japanese stuff. And that meant getting rid of Buddhism. And so they did their best to get rid of Buddhism. They weren't overly successful, but they've really drawn a wedge between Shinto and Buddhism. So now that they're two distinct things, whereas if you were in Japan, say in the 18th century, they would have been very much blended together. So what do they believe about the spirits and God and all of that? They believe that kami, which is the divine essence, the divine spirit, whatever you want to call it, is manifested in people, in living things, and in inanimate objects. So in other words, the spirit of the gods, it's not completely something like pantheism where everything is equally in God, because they believe that certain places and certain things have more of a portion of God. As it says there, specific places are where you interface with them. Shrines in particular, but also natural settings like mountains or waterfalls are a place where or a lake are a place, usually a serene place, a natural place, a place where a shrine might be made, and they become the places where you go to worship, where you go to interact with this spirit, with the gods. And I will not, I guess I could attempt to, but I will butcher this one. That is a word and a half. Amen Akanushi. At least 30% right. And here's the translation: the heavenly ancestral God of the originating heart of the universe. Did you get all that? That's why it's such a big word. The Chinese, the Shinto, those followers of Shinto, excuse me, Chinese. Sorry, Japanese people, I didn't mean to say Chinese. The Japanese people who follow Shinto believe that that is the name of the first kami, the one who came into being alone. Now, there's a little itsy-bitsy piece of connection, because we believe that God is not created. He didn't come into being, but nothing brought him into being, so we're in the ballpark there. And they believe that that particular kami created the entire universe. And then the Japanese islands were created by two different kami interacting with each other, and they created Japan. So Japan is seen as a sacred island, as a sacred nation, because the whole thing is sort of the land of the gods. So if you are a follower of Shinto, one thing, you go to the shrines, you do the things at the shrines. Where does that show itself in ethics? And this is something that we're going to have to slow down and think to understand. Doing something wrong in Shinto creates impurity. Not at all sin. Don't think of it like sin. Don't think of it like guilt. Don't think of it like something on your ledger. It is impurity that you need to cleanse yourself from in order to have peace of mind, in order to have success in life. So it's not so much that wrong is wrong as it is that wrong creates difficulty. And we don't want that. And so in order to fix things, we need to purify ourselves. And the purification rites are called hare, and that is the heart of Shinto. There are rites that you do on a daily basis. There are rites you do every week. Ones you do winter, spring, summer, fall. Ones you do with the new moon or the waning moon. And ones you do yearly. So there are all sorts of rituals that one must perform in Shinto, some of them in your home, some of them at the shrines, in order to get rid of impurity, in order to be a good adherent of Shinto. The ethical outcrop of that is serenity, honesty, and purity. Very much, as I said, remember we said there was an influence of Taoism. That's Taoist ethics. The idea of not being out of control, of keeping oneself free of dishonor, right? Huge idea in Japanese culture is dishonor. Telling the truth keeps you from dishonor. Doing right by your family, obeying your parents, it keeps you from dishonor. And so you don't want those things, not because there is a God out there that will judge you on them, but because they're just bad. They slow you down. They mess you up. And so you just need to rid yourself of them. This is an idea that the Scientologists will borrow, and we look at them next. And so what do they have to say about the afterlife? Here's where they part company with Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. The followers of Shinto don't believe in reincarnation. This is your life. This is the one you've got. They do, however, believe that the dead join the spiritual realm, that your kami, your portion of the spirit, it goes back into sort of the spirit pool or the general spirit at your death, and you are sort of absorbed into it. And so one of the things that you will have at Shinto shrines, of course, is what we would term ancestor worship, which is a way of honoring your ancestors, their spirits, because their spirits are most connected to you at the shrines. One of the most controversial things of the last 75 years has been when a Japanese emperor goes to the World War II war shrine to pay homage to the dead of the war, to their spirits, and to do right by them. Anytime that happens, the Chinese and the Koreans are up in arms, because in a sense you're honoring those that committed, the rape of Nanking and whatnot. And so that's something that causes tension between them. Well, the history of Christianity and Shinto is one of the most interesting ones of all of the ones that we're talking about. If the history of Christianity and Judaism is the most complicated, and the history of Christianity and Islam is the most antagonistic, the history of Christianity and Shinto is the one that has the most up and down to it. When Christian missionaries arrived in 1549, and amongst them was a man named Francis Xavier, one of the more famous missionaries in Christian history, he was able to find many converts, 100,000 people by the 1570s. You show up with a few priests with you, and 20 years later you got 100,000 converts. I'd say something was going right. You must have been thinking, this is working. Whatever we're doing is working. However, in 1597, so not much later, the period of persecution began, and they ended up crucifying many of these Japanese Christians, in part because of the fear that the Japanese Christians were not going to be good Japanese citizens. Now, it's not a nation state yet, it's a bunch of kingdoms, but they had an issue with how it was messing with people's loyalties and people's culture, and so they tried to purge themselves of Christians. Those that survived were pushed into hiding for generations. There were no churches that one could go to. There were no, of course, this is before the printing press would have been over there. There's no way to get more Bibles into the country. There's no way to get outside support. There's no seminary training. I mean, this is a church underground. This is literally an underground church. And I talk about this more in my history of the church class. But you may have heard the saying that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, that martyrdom makes the church grow. The history of the church in Japan is the exception to that rule that makes you question whether that rule is true. Because martyrdom destroyed the church in Japan. They were persecuted for so long and for such an extended period of time that for all intents and purposes the church ceased to exist in Japan. They didn't rise up and conquer it, they were destroyed. And so for the will of God, and you can think about why God didn't intervene and didn't miraculously preserve them, et cetera, a little Daniel in the lion's den kind of thing, but it didn't. So it's not necessarily something to pray for as if that will be the salvation of the church, because here's an example where it didn't work. In 1873, with that Meiji Restoration, you have modern Japan coming into being. Freedom of religion was proclaimed. Part of this is because of the American Great White Fleet, right? Those battleships sailed into Tokyo Harbor, and the Japanese said, we really need to borrow Western ideas because look at the progress they've made scientifically in war. And so they welcomed in German and American advisors, chemists and metallurgists and whatnot, and all of that sort of thing. I forget the name of the movie with Tom Cruise where he goes to Japan and as a Civil War veteran. Samurai. The Last Samurai. That's that time period. It's about 50% history. The rest of it's, but that's the idea, is that they were bringing in Western ideas, and because of that outside pressure from the British and the Americans, they allowed, technically, freedom of religion. You could be whatever you want. However, when the Protestant missionaries arrived and said, okay, we're going to have the same success the Jesuits had 200 years ago, 300 years ago, it didn't work. They had great success in Korea, and there's a separate story about that. In Korea, the Christians were seen as heroes against Japanese aggression. They're the ones that stood up against the Japanese in World War II. And so after World War II, Christianity has a huge flowering in Korea because they're not imperialists, they're rebels. And that's a lot more attractive. In Japan, Christianity has been branded as an imperialist thing. It's a Western idea. And we might borrow their educational methods, their scientific methods, but we don't want their culture. We got to put some brakes on that. And so it was always seen as an outside, and still is, as an outside thing. Today, there are only somewhere between 1 and 3 million Japanese Christians. It's only 2.5%. And there has been tremendous effort in the last couple hundred years in mission agencies going to Japan. It just has not worked. It is one of the most difficult places in terms of the culture and the religion, right? Not a difficult place as in the government is murdering missionaries, but or throwing them in jail or kicking them out, but a difficult place in that the people are just not overly interested. It's just not working. And of course, people are still trying, but it is a difficulty. So how is Shinto doing today? 80% of the people of Japan practice Shinto. So even if you're not overly religious and you're Japanese, odds are you're going to go to the shrine and do your hooray, and you're going to go to the shrine and pay respect to your ancestors because it's the right thing to do. And it's like back in the day when most people were going to church, whether or not they were truly devoted, it was the right thing to do. It was expected of you. People would ask questions if you weren't there. You didn't want that, so you went. Well, most people in Japan, whether they're enthusiastic, whether they're true believers or not, most people in Japan are participants. However, 65% of them both also practice Buddhism. So there's a huge amount of overlap. Despite the fact that they were intertwined back by the Meiji Restoration, there's still that idea of Buddhism didn't die out. And you can see the overlap on the maps, right? Some of the most Shinto areas are also some of the most Buddhist areas. In the north, there's not much of either. There's a different story for that. The people that live on the northern island are a different ethnic group. They've got a different history than the rest of the Japanese. From the outside, we wouldn't know, but they certainly do. So anyway, it's very popular in Japan, and almost all the world's Shinto adherents are Japanese. So they're either in Japan or they're Japanese culturally and ethnically. So what does get in the way for evangelism? And this is something you can't overemphasize. This is super important in Japan. Religion is secondary. All right, in the Middle East, in Europe, in America, at least in the past, religion was the most important thing. Your religion was worth living for or dying for, or unfortunately sometimes killing for. But in Japan, it's never been that way. Religion is not first. Family is first. Your job is second. Your country is third, or some combination of those. Family is almost always first. Maybe country is second. Job is third. But religion, fourth, fifth. Therefore, in Japan, there is a strong emphasis on conformity. Being a rebel in Japan is not celebrated the way it is in the West. Okay, Martin Luther is a hero in the West because he stood up, right, and said, I'm not going to do it because it's wrong. That's not a hero in Japan. That's someone to say, don't be like him, because he's rocking the boat. You need to honor your ancestors. You need to honor your family. And so if you are Japanese and you are joining Christianity, if you're becoming a Christian, you will create division in your family. Almost certainly your family will disown you. They will be very upset with you. And therefore, culturally speaking, the way that you were raised, the values that you were taught as a child and growing up would tell you, don't do that. It's not worth it for a religious idea. Don't hurt your family over religion. Kind of have the opposite idea in the West, right? How many families have thrown things at each other over the Thanksgiving table over religious issues? We're more than willing to fight about religion even within our family, but in Japan, that's not it. You are a good Japanese citizen if you obey your family and let this religious stuff be what it'll be. And so to tell a Japanese person in order that accepting Jesus Christ and accepting the gospel is so important that it overshadows those things, goes against everything that they believe and are taught and understand in their culture. And that's one of the reasons it's so difficult, because you're asking them to put something first that everything that they believe tells them should be fourth or fifth. And of course, when you go to Japan, your average Japanese person doesn't know anything about Christianity, doesn't know anything about Christian ideas, concepts. You're talking a foreign language to them, even if you're speaking in Japanese. What they know about Christianity is from American TVs and movies. And Lord knows that didn't help them any, because we've done a poor job of portraying the faith. Even when we try, it's usually pretty poorly portrayed. And so it is difficult. It is one of the most difficult places. And it's unlikely to change anytime soon without, of course, a massive outpouring of the Holy Spirit, because you're going against the flow. And that's just not something that people appreciate there. Questions about Shinto? All right, we are on the home stretch, and I saved the most difficult for last, the one that we will struggle the most to get our head around. And I used to have this one at the beginning of this class, but after a while I realized this really makes more sense after we've looked at the Eastern religions, because this is basically a westernized version of Eastern philosophy and religion. all right, and that is Scientology. It is the most modern by far of any of the ones that we're talking about. It is the most controversial, the kind of thing that if you want to yell at people on Facebook, start talking about Scientology, and people will have opinions, and it could get ugly in a real hurry. So what on earth is Scientology? And before we start, I don't want us to be confused with these guys, the Church of Christ Scientists. That's Mary Baker Eddy's group from the 19th century, which of course is in that same time period as the Mormons and the Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses. It comes out of that same background. But the one thing that separates the Church of Christ Scientist from the rest of Christianity is that thing that you see every once in a while in the news when they refuse medical care. Right? Every once in a while, the government will be trying to get a kid a surgery or something to save their life, and the parents are saying, we don't believe in that, we only believe in faith healing. No medicine, no doctors, no surgeries, no vitamins. It's all about faith healing. That's their thing. However, in 1990, the census only showed 106,000 Christian Scientists. So it's one I didn't try to point out because it is microscopic compared to all of the rest of them. This is less than a tenth, say Jehovah's Witnesses or Seventh-day Adventists. So, but I don't want us to get confused because the word scientist is in it, and you might have been thinking scientist, Scientology. It's got to be the same thing. That would be mean to the Church of Christ Scientists. And just as I keep going, I have done my best to be respectful and honest and open about all of the other ones. I don't share that attitude towards Scientology because of all the ones we're talking about, Scientology is the one that most strongly fits in the idea of cult. And for a very good reason. Two things about Scientology that you cannot overlook. Number one is that it is a massive money-making scheme. And the people at the top of the pyramid are getting super rich off this. And secondly, they have declared that anybody that goes against them, go ahead and ruin them, destroy them. We'll talk about those things later, but that's something that kind of takes away some of the general respect that we show to other people when you're that destructive. It's modern. 1954, a man named L. Ron Hubbard was an American author. He decided that he was going to found this religion, and it came out of his counseling. He was a counselor, not a camp counselor, but like a psychological counselor, and he came up with a system called Dianetics. If you've seen the book Dianetics, that's L. Ron Hubbard's book. And the verbiage here, I got a lot of quotes for this because I have a hard time explaining it. Scientology is the science, means knowing about knowing, the science of knowledge. That's actually a branch of philosophy. It's called epistemology. Well, how do we know what we know? How do we know truth? How do we know fact? How does our brain process information? It's a whole branch of philosophy. So calling Scientology that is just his... he just decided to call it that. That already existed. But his way of going about these things has very little to do with the other branch. So in Scientology, and again, this is right off of their stuff, God is the eighth dynamic. And you were thinking, what on earth are dynamics? I don't know. Existence towards infinity is what they're talking about here. They sometimes call God the supreme being. This is the apex of the universe. All right? This is the culmination of the universe, is this eighth dynamic where God exists. And notice this. Only when the seventh dynamic, which is a spiritual dynamic, is reached in its entirety, will one discover and come to a full understanding of the eighth dynamic and one's relationship to the Supreme Being. In other words, until you get 95% of the way through Scientology, we can't really explain God to you because you're not ready for it. Now, again, within Christianity, there's a little bit of that because we don't believe we fully understand God. We don't believe we can understand the mind of God or the totality of God. But we certainly don't believe there's this distance between ourselves and God, that God is something that only the elite can understand. They don't believe in dogma. In other words, this is true and this is fact and this is theology. They basically say, you got to figure this stuff out on your own. It's an extremely self-help oriented group. You must go on the journey and find your way. And if you get there, then you'll see what we're talking about. But it's not really our business to direct you and guide you. You've got to get there on your own. Again, that's an idea he borrowed from Buddhism. The idea that each of us must find our own enlightenment, and maybe I can be a guide, but you're the one that's got to figure it out. So he borrowed that from there. So what is humanity? Now, these are things L. Ron Hubbard had to say. Number one, he said, man is an immortal spiritual being. We believe we are a spiritual being. Christians don't believe we're immortal. We don't believe we existed before God created us, and so we obviously can't be immortal because that means no beginning and no end. He believes that our experiences extend well beyond a single lifetime. Anytime you're talking about a single lifetime and going beyond it, you're borrowing the idea of reincarnation. So there's another idea he borrowed from the East. But in something that's not really emphasized within Hinduism or Buddhism is the idea that you can have a connection to those past lives. Right? A Hindu would believe that your past lives influence your future lives, but not necessarily that you could remember your past lives or that you would still be affected by your past lives once you're reborn. But Scientologists believe that you are. And of course, they believe, as do the people of the East, that humanity is basically good. If this is a self-help program, you can't have humanity being fallen and corrupted, because then how can one help oneself? That wouldn't make any sense. All right, I'm gonna read more from this than any of the other ones because if I don't read it verbatim, I'll lose you. Scientology says that you have two parts to your mind, and they're not talking east-west hemisphere of your mind. It's not organic, but two parts to your mind. You've got a reactive mind where all of your pain and emotional trauma ends up. And they would say all of the pain and emotional trauma from your past lives. So all the bad stuff that happens to you in life ends up in your reactive mind. You also have an analytical mind where your rational thoughts happen, where your consciousness is, your thinking occurs. So they're saying that your emotional problems and trauma are separate from your thinking and your rational mind. Most of us wish that were true because we know that our trauma and our problems and our fears and our anxieties, they absolutely affect our rational thinking, and they can really mess with it. However, they said that reactive mind stores those mental images. They're not available to your analytical mind. In other words, you don't really know how much trauma you have received. You're not aware of all of the problems and all of the bad things that are accumulating in your own mind because your rational mind isn't aware of them. Those bad things they call engrams. L. Ron Hubbard just made a lot of words up, so these are his words. He called them engrams. And he said those engrams, those bad things, that bad mojo that your reactive mind is accumulating, that is painful, it's debilitating, it messes you up. And so as they accumulate, as you get more and more of them, you get further and further away from what you're supposed to be. Now, a little bit of this is borrowed from Buddhism, right? The idea that your cravings, and the more you go after cravings, things that you can't keep and aren't permanent, the further away from the Eightfold Path you would have been. So the Buddhists would say you need to let go of these things, you need to understand what is real, you need to not hold on to your anger or your disappointment. And so there's a connection here. So the purpose, then, the primary directive of Scientology is to get rid of those engrams, to get rid of that bad stuff that has happened to you so that you can function the way you are supposed to be. Quote, "The ultimate goal of Scientology is true spiritual enlightenment and freedom for all." Well, that sounds great. Wouldn't we all want to be free, truly free in our spirit? They say that a person's spiritual salvation depends upon himself, his fellows, and his attainment of brotherhood with the universe. In other words, it's up to you. You got to get this done yourself. Nobody's going to save you. Nobody can help you per se. You got to do it yourself. Again, similar to Buddhism, you must walk the path. It's self-help. The goal of Scientology is to end reincarnation. Now remember, we said that one part of Buddhism was that to attain Buddhahood and go along the path of reincarnation helping other people. The other part was to find nirvana and stop being reincarnated. So L. Ron Hubbard took that idea about ending reincarnation and said your goal is to stop that by rejecting material reality and recognizing that only the Thetan truly exists. That's your soul. The only thing that really exists is the spiritual realm. This doesn't really exist. This isn't really real. And the only way to get there are through the secret mystical teachings available to members at the higher levels. And one of the things that people that have been in Scientology will explain to you is how much money it costs to get to the higher levels. To go from level 4 to level 5, from level 3 to level 4 is a massive financial, thousands and thousands of dollars you have to pay for the seminars and the training that are necessary to advance. But you don't know, the further you get into it, the deeper you get into it, the more they tell you, now you're making progress, now you're getting the deeper knowledge, you get in deep. It's kind of like a scam, right? You put your money in, and they call you back and say, oh, if you give us another $1,000, then we'll send you your check for $100,000. And you say, oh, duh, and you send them another $1,000. And then they call you again and say, something's wrong, you need another $500. And you just keep putting more in because you already put a lot in, and you want to get it out. Whereas we're all like, because we know it doesn't work that way. But it's not the kind of teaching that you're supposed to talk about. It's secret stuff. It's super secret. Now, many of the ancient religions had this flavor. There were many religions in the Roman Empire at the time of Christ where they had secret initiation rites, and only the true masters knew what the religion was actually about. Kind of like a secret society, something Dan Brown would have loved, right? What's really going on with the Illuminati? What's really going on with these various brotherhoods, right? They've all got super secret stuff going on. That's actually true in Scientology. The people at the top know what's going on. The people at the bottom do not. And then we get auditing. And this is not the happy, fun auditing from the IRS, which you all, I'm sure, hope for someday. This is a different kind of auditing. In Dianetics, his book, he talks about how an auditor, which is a counselor, will help a person clear through a conscious recall of past traumatic events. In other words, this is thinking about your traumatic events from the past and dealing with them so that you can move on. That's actually part of psychotherapy. Therapists all over the world do that. Someone's been traumatized, right? They've been abused, they've been raped, they've been beat, they've had some horrid event happen. Well, they've got to deal with it. They've got to process it and understand it so they can move past it. That's nothing new. Hubbard just took that idea and said, well, we're doing it a different way. He introduced the concept of the Thetan because people in his groups, in his counseling groups, said that they were experiencing trauma from their past lives. And so he incorporated that idea into his process. The goal of auditing is to get clear, to get freedom from all of those bad things, those engrams in your reactive mind, so that you can understand and know the true spiritual being that you are. All right. In order to do this, you need an e-meter, which this comes out of left field. This is not something you got from Buddhism or Taoism or any of that. That's the picture in the top right is an e-meter. It's pseudoscience. Biochemical waves and whatnot. The auditor uses the e-meter to help you process your engrams. It's mumbo jumbo. It's not based in real science in any way, but it's of course something that you can only buy from their store and an expensive thing and all of that. It's part of the thing. And this is something that Hubbard and Scientologists are also famous for. Because Hubbard was rejected by the psychiatric community, which he used to be a part of, but in his professional career, they said, yeah, no, to some of his new ideas, he became their most outspoken critic. Scientology remains vehemently opposed to psychiatry and psychology. So even though he's basically taking ideas from psychology and transforming them and putting them within Scientology, he says that psychology is evil. Here's a quote. Psychiatry spawned the ideology which fired Hitler's mania, turned the Nazis into mass murderers, and created the Holocaust. Bet you never heard someone blame psychiatrists for the Holocaust, which is out there. Because I'm not sure where that's coming from. I think Hitler could have used a good psychologist when he was younger, maybe help him deal with some of his issues. He also said the effects of medical and psychiatric drugs, whether painkillers, tranquilizers, antidepressants, he puts them in quotes because he doesn't believe they're real, are disastrous as illegal drugs. Now, I'm not talking about opioids, but he's saying things like antidepressants that people with serious medical conditions take. He said you might as well just take heroin, because that stuff's just as bad. And so he's basically rejected anything that a psychologist, a counselor, a psychiatrist wants to do. It's all nuts. And some of his more famous followers, of course, most of the people that you know that are Scientologists are from Hollywood, because that's where their strength is. They have gotten in hot water in the sense for ripping into people that get therapy, people that have psychiatric care, and not small in the controversy. That's the most famous Scientologist in the world today, Tom Cruise. The other one is Mr. Staying Alive, John Travolta. But John Travolta's career is lower than Tom Cruise right now, even though Tom Cruise is getting up there. You can't get good statistics about how many Scientologists there are in the world today, because the Scientologists will tell you, oh, we've got like 10, 12, 14 million people worldwide. But the 2006 US Census, only 25,000 people said they were Scientologists. So there were either millions of people that are Scientologists who didn't want to say so on the census, for some reason, or they're making those numbers up. All the evidence shows that they're making those numbers up. And so I would normally not talk about Scientology because it's a small group compared to the other ones, but they have an outsized impact. Because of the cult-like nature, because of the financial scheme, because of some of their famous adherents, most people have heard of Scientology. And then, of course, Hubbard said that if you leave Scientology and go out in the world and say it's a scam, it's a cult, then they're going to ruin your life. Literally, you can destroy them. Go ahead, harass them, punish them, ruin them. And not that other religions haven't been the same way towards people that leave. Most of us don't like apostates, whether you're Muslim or Christian or Buddhist. Apostates can be a real pain. But within Scientology, it's officially been sanctioned. Go ahead and ruin them. We've kind of moved past that in Christianity. We don't burn people at the stake anymore. We don't pull out their fingernails if they become an apostate. But the Scientologists are like, go get them. So what gets in your way if you're trying to witness to a Scientologist? Well, basically, like the Eastern religions, it's self-help. All right? You don't need outside help. It's works-based. You do it yourself. So if you go to a Scientologist and say you need to repent of your sins, you need to be saved by the grace of God, They're like, no, I'm making progress here. I'm on the 4th dynamic. I keep at this, I'll be in the 5th next year, but boom, I'm fine. I don't need any of that. I don't need your help. And then, of course, it is cult-like. It's a big business. It's hostile to its critics, and it's secretive. So getting to know a Scientologist and befriending a Scientologist is not an easy thing. They make the Seventh-day Adventists look like amateurs in terms of closing ranks. I'm sorry, Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm saying the wrong one. They make the Jehovah's Witnesses look like amateurs, right? Because they say, don't read anybody else's literature. If you leave us, you're dead to us, kind of thing. The Scientologists are like, boom, it's scary business. And so a lot of people don't get out of it when they get into it. Or if they do, they're so traumatized by this experience that they're not going to be looking for religion after that. So there's Scientology. Questions about Scientology? I did not. There are a lot of exposés and whatnot that come out, but one of the things that is difficult to assess is how accurate they are, because we don't know what is officially going on inside, because we're on the outside and they keep it a secret. But there have been a number of ones like that, much like there have been people that have escaped from polygamous Mormon sects, and they're telling the true story about what's going on. And so there will continue to be people that get out and say what's going on, and it will continue to be a thing, but it's not going to have large appeal. They're not going to have large number of converts, because your average person can't afford to be. This is a thing for people of good means. Poor people can't be Scientologists because you can't afford to be.
How are people getting drawn into this to begin with?
Successful people that just want to do better in life, and so someone tells them, I got something that's going to help you reach, you're here, but I'll get you up here. Like all those seminars that happen at the airport Ramada, right? Where someone says, here's the secret to succeeding at business. The 4 ways to flip houses and make big money. It's the same kind of thing, only without the house flipping and whatnot, where people get brought in because they're looking to do better. They think they're fine, they're looking to do better. And so, there they are. And then you're part of it. So, all right, we'll call it quits there, and that'll be the end of it. Anything...